Welcome back to educator.com. In today's lesson, we're going to go over some major graphs and basically review it. So let's get straight into the lecture. So in today's lesson, we are going to put all your macroeconomic knowledge to work. We're going to be able to break down economic language and correctly answer questions that may appear on the AP FRQ portion of the macroeconomics exam. I'm going to actually go out on a limb here. At least one of the graphs, at least two of the graphs will absolutely appear on the AP macro exam. Now, it might not be the same shift, maybe it'd be a variation, but these graphs are sure to appear on the AP macro portion of your exam because this is what macroeconomics is about. So you can actually predict what's going to be on the AP FRQ exam. So if you understand this, then you're in pretty good shape here. And so basically we're going to review the major graphs of the AP macro exam. So if you're able to understand and break down the language and be able to graphically analyze it, then you're in good shape. So let's get started right here. All right, so here is the situation. I'm going to go through this here. I'm going to break it down individually a little bit later here. But hopefully you can see when you get a huge chunk like this, to be able to break it down. Now chances are you're not going to get something this this dense on the AP FRQ. You're going to get bits and portions and chunks, and the key is to be able to analyze how each event is going to affect and which graph to use and what to label for each graph. But again, these are concepts we've already gone over, so all this is basically review. So let's go over and read this part of the scenario here. So assume the U.S. economy is operating at an aggregate output level above the potential output. Draw a graph showing AD, SRAS, LRAS, equilibrium output, and aggregate price level. Now assume the Fed uses contractionary monetary policy. Identify the open market operation the Fed would use and draw a money market graph to show the effect of monetary policy on the nominal interest rate. Show how the Fed's actions will affect equilibrium in the aggregate demand and supply graph you drew previously and the new aggregate price level. Okay, that's only part of it here. We're going to go even further here. Draw a graph of the foreign exchange market for the US dollar showing how a change in the price level affects the US dollar relative to the euro and how will the Fed's contractionary monetary policy affect the real interest rate in the United States here. So if you're able to get this down and draw it on one graph, no problem, then you're well on your way to a 5 on the AP macro. If you're having a little trouble kind of putting it together, or you want to test whether or not you know how to do this, I'd recommend using a blank sheet of paper, pause my lecture as you're going along, and then see if you've done this correctly. But the key here is not to get overwhelmed by all the different graphs you're going to draw, but just go step by step, go marginally, go bits and chunks, and see if you understand that. All right, so the first thing is the inflationary gap. So being able to draw the inflationary gap. So let's break down what's actually being asked of you in terms of the portions of the question. So assume the U.S. economy is operating at an aggregate output level above the potential output here. Draw a graph showing the aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, equilibrium output, and aggregate price level. Okay, so let's just stop right there. To get to, this is the basic macroeconomics graph. This is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, have the short run and have the long run as well. But if you're operating at an aggregate output that is above, so this is above the potential output, then you have what's called this inflationary gap. So how do you draw an inflationary gap? So let's go ahead and draw this scenario here. So you have the x-axis is going to be real GDP here. Okay, the y-axis is going to be so you have the real GDP here, and you have the aggregate price level. So if you just put price level, it should be okay, but it doesn't hurt to write aggregate price level here. And aggregate demand here. Now, what is aggregate demand? AD. Let's label this AD1 here. And remember, aggregate demand, so let's put all the macroeconomics as much as we can onto each single page here. The aggregate demand is going to be Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. So what's composed of this aggregate demand is consumer expenditures plus business investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. So when you see this equation here, Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX right here, when you see this, you're really referring to this graph that you see right here on the AD, the aggregate demand. Now, so you have this AD right here. Let's draw the SRAS here. The SRAS is going to be the short-run aggregate supply curve, and it's going to be kind of like the supply curve that you see in just a basic supply and demand graph. Label this SRAS1. Now, again, this is in the short run, so the equilibrium output is going to be right here. Okay, so this is called this PL1 right here, and let's call this Y1. So Y1 is where the equilibrium output is. So we have the equilibrium output, and we have the aggregate price level here. What we don't have is the long run aggregate supply. Now, if we are above the potential output, then this is going to be greater than the long run here, than the long run can sustain. So the long run here is going to be right here, the LRAS. LRAS is going to be to the left of the short run equilibrium because the short run has exceeded the long run here. So let's call this YP. Okay. Now assume the Fed uses contractionary monetary policy. Now we'll graph this later, and I'll re-graph this here, but I'll show you exactly what you would have to do. If contractionary monetary policy is used, then the government is going to sell government securities, and what's going to happen is that interest rates are going to go up, and therefore consumption and or investments are going to go down. So you take a look at here, consumption or business investment goes down. As a result, the aggregate demand will shift to the left here. So that's what happens when contractionary monetary policy is used. Okay. Now here's the question. Identify the open market operation the Fed would use, again, to contract the economy. Let's just stop right there. So let's review again, what are the things that the Fed does. So the Fed uses monetary policy, and it can either use expansionary or it can use contractionary. Okay, so this is Fed monetary policy. Now again, there are three basic tools of either expansionary or monetary, but let's take a look at expansionary. Expansionary, they can either lower discount rates, they can lower the required reserve ratio, or they can buy government securities. Now, when they buy government securities after lowering target federal funds rate. So these things will expand the money supply here. Now, the open market operation that the Fed uses to contract the economy is the opposite here. So let's take a look here at what the Fed could do to contract the money supply. They could raise the discount rate. They could raise the required reserve ratio, which is the amount of money, the amount of money that banks are required to hold onto their vaults, basically. So if the required reserve ratio went from 10% to 90%, then instead of banks being able to lend out $900 for every $1,000 that they have, they'd only be able to lend out $100. And so there'd be a contracting of the money supply. Or, and this is the open market operations here, so they could sell government securities. Again, this is usually after the raising of target Fed funds rate. Now I'm getting maybe a little bit more technical than what's required on the AP exam, but it doesn't hurt to know more than what's actually required to get the 5 on the AP exam here. But this here is going to be what's referred to as, this is open market operations. So when the question asks, identify the open market operation the Fed would use, it's saying either buying or selling of government securities. Now, if you want to expand the money supply, expansionary monetary policy, then you would buy. You'd buy, bloat the economy here. If you sell government securities, then you would shrink. You shrink the money supply by selling government securities, because you're putting IOUs back into the banks and you're taking away the money supply. So identify the open market operation, and in this case, it's going to be sell government securities. Now, how is that going to look on the corresponding graph? So the answer is sell government securities. Now, how does that look in terms of the money market graph here? So here's the money market graph. Okay, so here's the quantity of money on the y-axis or x-axis. Okay, and then here's a nominal interest rate. And let's label this nominal interest rate as R. And when you draw the demand for money, here's the money demand. It's going to be a downward sloping graph here. The one thing here that you want to use with money supply, so that's MS, you have money demand and money supply here. You want to use a straight vertical line here. Why vertical line? Because the Fed controls the money supply, and so it's going to be a straight vertical line down. So, money is going to be somewhat neutral in this case, but you can either shift the money supply to the right or to the left. So expansionary would be money supply shift to the right here. Contractionary monetary policy is the money supply shift to the left here, and that's what's happening right here. So the interest rate went from R1, and you shift the money supply to the left, which is what contractionary monetary policy will do. And now you have R2 here. So what is the effect of monetary policy on the nominal interest rate? So the nominal interest rate increases from R1 to R2, so there is less quantity of money. So there's less. Makes sense. When interest rates go up, people are going to borrow less money for the reason being that the interest rates are higher than they were before, and so there's going to be less loans that are taken out. All right, well, let's take a look at this here. You have higher interest rates, so higher interest rates equals decreased investments. Now again, going back to that same formula here, so again, understanding and being able to utilize these graphs and how they work in terms of equations is very essential here. So we know that y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. So when interest rates go up, both consumption and investment is going to decrease. So what you have here is this goes down here. So aggregate demand is going to decrease here. So show how the Fed's action will affect equilibrium in the aggregate demand and supply graph you drew previously. and the new aggregate price level. So if the aggregate demand decreases, then what's going to happen to the price level and what's going to happen to the real GDP? Well, let's go ahead and find out here. So you draw this graph accordingly. So this is our GDP here, or Y, not RGY, but our GDP, or Y. And on the Y-axis is the aggregate price level. And when you're drawing this here, you have the aggregate demand here, and you have the aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply. And here's this equilibrium output here, and this is Y1, and this is PL1. And again, you had the inflationary output, so the LRAS is to the right, LRAS. Okay, this is the YP, Y potential. So when the Fed uses contractionary monetary policy, when it sells bonds, the aggregate demand is going to decrease here, because when C and I goes down, Y goes down, which is aggregate demand here. And so AD will shift to the left and it will go back to this equilibrium, or as close to there as possible. So it will be in long run equilibrium. Okay. So what happens to the price level? Okay. So the aggregate price level goes down. So aggregate price level decreases as a result of contractionary fiscal policy. No, not fiscal, I'm sorry. Contractionary monetary policy, and aggregate output decreases. Okay, so basically you have this situation that we've seen here. Okay, now let's take a look at the exchange market. Okay, so draw a graph of the foreign exchange market for the US dollar, showing how a change in the price level affects the US dollar relative to the euro, and how will the Fed's contractionary monetary policy affect the real interest rate in the long run in the US here. Now let's actually answer the second part first here. How will the Fed's contractionary monetary policy affect the real interest rate in the long run in the US? And the answer to this here is no effect in the long run. The reason being is that money is neutral. So since money is neutral, monetary has a short run but not a long run impact. Now, when there's short run impact, there's a loss of jobs, creation of jobs. So to be sure, short run impact does have an impact, but the idea is that in the long run, money is neutral. Money isn't really the whole point of the economy. The whole point of the economy is growing the economy, and money might stimulate one way or the other in the short run, but in the long run, money actually has no power to actually create economic growth in the long run. So let's draw a graph of the foreign exchange market of the US dollar here. Okay, so here's the quantity of dollars. Okay, now this is, again, since this is the x-axis is dollars, you want to use euros per dollar. So here's the supply and demand, the exchange rate here. So this is the supply of US dollars, this is demand, and you get E1 right here, and you get Q1 right here. the change in the price level. So this is dependent on what you had before. Now the change in the price level, it went down. Okay, so if the change in the price level goes down, things become cheaper in the United States, and therefore the demand for US currency is going to increase. So demand increases from D1 to D2, and you have Q2 right here, and you have E2 right here. Okay, so the quantity of US dollars is going to increase because the demand for US dollars increases. And so what happens to the value of the dollar? So the dollar has appreciated because demand for US dollars has increased. So hopefully being able to see how you tie the aggregate demand graph to the money market graph, how you tie that to the exchange rate graph, hopefully that makes sense. So a lot of these FRQ problems are going to rely not on just knowledge of one graph, but being able to see the connection between the two. So it's more important to understand the reasoning and the logic and the flow. So theoretically, if you got this graph right, but it was based on a previously wrong assumption, then you won't get credit on the AP exam. So it's make sure you know the impact that interest rates will have on the exchange rate, the impact that lowered interest rates have on the aggregate demand, and see how these graphs actually connect with one another. Thank you for watching educator.com.